history of Egypt and the Copts of Egypt. Today we're going to talk about Crusades that happened during the 11th century. Early on in 1199, during the Fatimid dynasty, the Fatimids actually were becoming very weak as a dynasty, controlling northern Africa up until Spain and stretching over into the south, Egypt, into Sudan. This huge region was governed by the Fatimids. And during that time, the Crusaders were trying to establish a pilgrimage route actually to Jerusalem. The main reason was that the pilgrims were being attacked by the inhabitants of the region, and they were forbidden from traveling to Jerusalem to do their annual pilgrimage to the churches there and to the holy Christian sites. The Crusades had the reason for being, and the first Crusade started during that time at actually 1099, and they were successful at the beginning. They actually established the Kingdom of Jerusalem, took parts of Tripoli, parts of Antioch, ancient Antioch, which actually eroded parts of the Fatimid dynasty and their power. They actually tried to invade Egypt at the time, and they succeeded in landing in Damietta, which is actually the northern part of Egypt, in between the two bifurcation of the Nile. The problem with the Crusaders is that they were very disappointed in the Christian Egyptians. They knew that there were, of course, Christians in Egypt, the Copts. They were disappointed in them because they were not supported by them in any which way. This was due, at the beginning actually, the Copts were very supportive of the Crusades, and they were thinking of rooting for them and supporting them. But once they learned that the Roman Pope was involved and he had his opinions about Coptic Church, was trying again to convert the national church into a Roman church and invading their faith, taking over the rights of worshipping in peace. The Copts actually were biased totally against the Crusaders and did not support them at all, and actually supported the Muslim ruler, the weak Fatimid dynasty and the Muslim ruler. They had a wali, or the governor of Egypt under the Fatimid Khalifa was Badr al-Gamali at the time at 1101. Early on in the 11th century, in the 12th century, supported the Muslim government at the time against the Crusades. The Crusades didn't understand that, and they were very ticked off at the Copts. Early on, they issued decree, well, actually issued by the Roman Pope or papacy at the time, that they would be forbidden from pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which they actually did before the Crusades. They were not allowed to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem when Jerusalem was under the control of Crusades and the Roman papacy. When the Crusaders came and took over villages, they were indiscriminate in the damage that they did. They attacked Christians, Muslims, old people, young people, kids, women, everybody. They destroyed mosques, they took over churches, they baptized kids thinking their bishops, they came with them, baptized kids, and thinking that they would stay Christians, and they actually took the kids away from their families, not knowing who they belonged to, whether they're Muslims or Christians or whatever. They were very indiscriminate to the population, the local population, in the small villages that they were able to land in. The damage that they did just turned away everybody from them. The backlash to these crusades, that was not one crusade, there were several crusades, I believe 11 or 12 crusades all through the history. It is beyond our scope to talk about the Crusades and the damages that they did to Egypt and other countries that they landed in. But they were able to hold Jerusalem and control it, and were able to establish a safe route for the pilgrims traveling from Europe to Jerusalem to do their annual visits to the holy sites. The pilgrimage was established to Jerusalem, and of course the Fatimids were not able to defend Jerusalem, and they lost it to the Franks at first, who stayed in Jerusalem. And the backlash to this, to the Christians of Egypt, was because the Muslims considered them, okay, they were Christians and the invaders are Christians, so by extension, if we have to destroy the local Christian population. And so they started another huge wave of persecution against the Copts, damaging their properties, taking away their churches, murders, killings, and these were sanctioned because they were thinking, okay, that they were saving their country at the time, because the Christians of Egypt would join together with the Crusades and crush the Muslims in Egypt. At the time, the Copts were a minority, they were not a majority in the country, and they were persecuted for whatever whim or reason that the Muslims decided to persecute them again for, and they found a good reason at the time, which was the Crusades that were going on. They were afraid that at least they would be spies, at the very least, not considering even supporting the foreigners against the local populations if they would, and if they wanted to, they could have. But actually the Copts were very turned against the Crusaders as a result of the decrees that the Byzantine Pope at the time, the Roman Pope, decided that he would annex all the churches in the countries that they invaded. They were considering the local Coptic population, local Christian populations, as much as heretics, as much as the Muslims that the infidel Muslims that lived in the countries. So to them there was no difference between a Muslim and a Christian. As a result, well, the Christians of Egypt decided, well, I'm not going to support an invading force that destroyed the population, irrelevant of their religion, irrelevant of their belief. Whilst I know the local governing Muslim was somewhat fair to the Christian population that lived. Although there were persecutions, and sometimes there were very severe persecutions, but at least they were able to survive all through that time, the Muslim invasion, and were able to, at least at some point in time, to prosper and to build churches and to worship in peace. They were not subjected to what the Crusaders were subjecting them to, because they were Christians like them, but they did not believe. They believed that the Coptic population was a heretic sect of Christianity, and they decided to take over their churches and change them into Roman churches. This was the situation at early 12th century. Continue with the 12th century. Later on in the 12th century, the Fatimid Empire basically dissolved, and it ended with the 14th Khalifa to this dynasty. They ruled for quite a long stretch of time, but as occurs, dynasties die out. The upcoming dynasty was that of the Ayyubids. It started by Salah ad-Din. Salah ad-Din was one of the old school warriors that ruled with an iron fist. He controlled a huge stretch of parts of Africa, parts of Asia, Syria, up until modern-day Turkey. He was very ruthless in his conquests. His base was in Egypt, but he rarely stayed in Egypt. He left to his wazir or his wali or his governor to rule Egypt in his stead. He was ruthless with all his opponents. He actually destroyed entire countries. There was a huge fight between him and the governor of Jerusalem, which was under the control of the Crusaders. Many wars were fought between them. At the end, Salah ad-Din was able to establish terms with Jerusalem at times, and other times he was able to achieve conquest and expel the European rulers or the European kings that tried to establish a pilgrimage route to Jerusalem. During all that time, the Copts actually did not care who was in power or who was lived in the castle that ruled Egypt. They were only occupied with their daily, day-to-day life, their livelihood, their faith, praying in peace, not being subjected to persecution, but that always did not happen. The Muslim rulers were sometimes fair, but mostly were unfair to them. They were always skeptical of that the Egyptians or that the Copts of Egypt would take over the country at any moment, because they were still forced to reckon with. What happened is, at times of tranquility and at times that there were no persecutions, the Copts would be able to build their churches, worship, take government jobs, worship in peace, be able to amass a lot of money. They were mostly farmers, mostly agricultural workers. During the time of Salah ad-Din, he was not unfair. He kicked them out of the government, but eventually he realized that he cannot rule Egypt, or he cannot manage Egypt without the help of the local Coptic population, due to their advanced knowledge of the country, of the sciences, of medicine, in all the professional works in Egypt. They were the leading part. They played a very strong role in all of Egypt, and he had no means of doing without them. So gradually, eventually, he adopted back into the government. Whenever there was a huge persecution, they were either collected, these government workers were collected and were forced either to adopt Islam or to renounce their religion or die. These are the choices you have: either become a Muslim or die, or you pay the jizya if you're not a government worker, which everybody did at the time. The worship, like the places of worship, like churches, monasteries, were basically left alone because they were far off from the cities. The churches were sometimes sacked, they were destroyed according to the persecution that happened. During the time of Salah ad-Din also, people were forced to adopt the Arabic language. Even before that, way before that, they were forced to adopt the Arabic language. They were forced to relinquish their Coptic original language. Gradually but surely, they had to relinquish the Coptic language in favor of the Arabic language. Public workers were forced to, because they had to write everything in Arabic and forsake the Greek and the Coptic. At one point in history, they were forced by saying that, or actually decreeing that if the mothers spoke in Coptic to their kids, they would lose their tongues, they would have their tongues cut off, and that actually forced people to adopt the Arabic language in favor of the Arabic language in Egypt over the Coptic or the Greek languages. The Egyptian Copts, when they adopted the Arabic language, they excelled in it, and they translated all the works that they had in Coptic and in Greek to Arabic, and they have so many volumes and works in Arabic that surpassed any that they had before. And on that note, we will close this episode, and we'll continue next time. Thank you.